YouTube fellow community, Beach Boys, Smile fans, random people on the internet. My name is Giggens. We are here today with the awesome Mr. Frederick French Pounds here. Back to mono, if you will. HypnoticFred on Instagram. Hey, buddy, how's it going?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, it's all good and jolly. How are things with you?
Good. I'm really glad you're here today because for those who haven't watched anything that Fred's done or listened to his podcasts, he puts out this great series called Back to Mono on, well, it's available wherever podcasts are streaming. Um, Frederick does these deep dives into these records where he'll play the song, different stereo mixes, go into the history of the record. And it's so much fun to listen to you talk about this stuff because your enthusiasm is just so vibrant and you get so wrapped up into it. So when this whole Smile thing started coming up, I was like, he'd be good to have on here. He knows his stuff with Smile. He's a huge Beach Boys nerd like me. We could do
Yeah,
this.
I
Uh,
can see we've both got the box set in the background of the video.
there it is. It's
Um,
next to my brand new 8-track player up there. It's
that's nice. Um,
Sonic.
it may come off the shelf at some point if I need to reference something. So I may move. We'll see.
Well, I want to start off with your relationship with the album. I know you've been a Beach Boys fan for a long time. How did you discover Smile, and what were your initial reactions to it?
So this is something that when you originally put the call out, I kind of what excited me because I enjoy talking about it because it's so weird. I was back in 2011, I guess. I was kind of sort of flirting on the edge. My Beach Boys introduction, which I've gone into depth elsewhere, basically free copy of Pet Sounds, got into that eventually, but not first. And then somewhere down the line, I got into the hits, but not really. I was disappointed by them, but then carry on and slowly like sort of fluffing around as such. And then I remember weirdly, because I was in this huge Beatles kick still and just slowly getting into other 60s stuff. And there was the a big thing come up that when Al leaked that the Smile was coming out, sort of thing, as Al does. And despite I can't remember if I'd actually listened to any version of Smile yet at that stage or not, but I remember being like, oh, okay, that's quite cool. Like, because I'd heard of it and there was this whole thing around, and I thought, okay, sounds interesting.
Yeah.
And then between that and the release of the box set, I this is my relationship with Smile is where it kind of happened because I took such a deep dive into the whole thing. I downloaded so many fan mixes, so many. I listened to so many, just
Just those days.
basically a different one every day.
Yeah.
I wish I
Yep.
had them all still, but weirdly, on my old hard drive, out of every folder in my music folder, the one folder that corrupted was my Beach Boys folder.
No.
So I don't have
Oh,
those anymore. Which, to be fair, my favorite one is the one I feel like I had it as the Smile Philistine compilation. I think it was also called Alternate Brian Wilson Presents Smile. It was kind of
huh.
it was a longer one, but it had a lot of like studio chatter interspersed with it. So it had
Yeah.
like a bit of like Murray talking in Child is Father the Man, or in the
That's cool.
background of the old Lang Syne line in Surfs Up that has the should old acquaintance playing there and things like that. Completely unlikely, but
I've
I
never
loved
heard
that
that.
version. Um, and then the build up to the box set, just insane. That was probably one of my peaks of being like into music as such, my excitement, because I was
Yeah.
oh, what it was 2012, wasn't it? No, 2011 the box came out.
Yeah. 11. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was 16, so I was in that like ripe, youthful, everything's exciting phase. Um, and I remember the build up. It was when albums still came out here on Thursdays, I think, and then they came out on Mondays in the US. And then
Yeah.
it was
Monday or Tuesday. I
then
can't remember.
in the or was it Fridays it came out here? It always came out early. No, it was Fridays here. And then there was a CD shop in Sevenoaks where my dad was working at the time, and he was kind of friendly with them. And it was kind of still that stage where he could go in, and the day they got the delivery, he could buy it and take it. So I got it a few days early.
Oh my God.
And I remember he sent me the photo earlier on of it in the box, and I was just so excited. I posted the picture on the SMiLE message board, and everyone just like blew up, sort of thing. I mean, that's the time capsule in itself, but
I know, yeah,
um,
right.
and that was, and when it came home, because I throughout all of this and to this day, I am obsessed with Child is Father of the Man, just everything about that for whatever reason, and
Yeah,
that still continues on to this day. And I remember playing it, and um just during when I heard that chorus, it was so clean compared to any bootleg version. I just remember just audibly saying, "Wow!" Like,
yeah,
and I my dad commenting on that afterwards, just that he heard me say that from the other room, sort of thing. It was just, yeah, it was an experience, and I mean, beyond that, it's my relationship after that. I listened to it endlessly for that year. Like, I assume time at that stage, everything feels longer than it really is.
yeah,
And it's got to that point now where I don't dig it out very often. I think because it was never officially finished, and I'm such a vintage mix person, it kind of doesn't blend in that way.
yeah,
Um, I love a lot of the material. But it almost, especially when there was the sale on like the year of SMiLE, basically going through everything, so much of it just frustrates me at this stage of like everything, all the vocal stuff that was almost recorded but not quite.
right, right.
And I get that a lot when I listen. I have to really disconnect myself from that and just enjoy what does exist,
Yep.
and that's where the challenge sort of comes in. But there's still so many great bits in there that I do get a kick out of it. So
Yeah.
in the short, relatively anyway, that's kind of where I sit with SMiLE as such, and that's what, and I will always love it for that time, sort of between, I guess, yeah, 2010 and 2011 and 2012, I guess, going up to the eventual release of That's Why God Made the Radio. That was
Yeah.
kind of my big SMiLE period. And if you go back into my Facebook from then, you'd probably find that there. um it was a wild ride, and
Good time to be a fan back then.
yeah, it was yeah, just yeah, I loved it, and yeah, basically regardless of where I am now, that is always the special place for me.
I love that nostalgia that music does for us, where it's always going to be a part of our lives because it was so pivotal as we're growing up. Um, which leads me to my next question, which is my favorite one that I've been asking everybody. If SMiLE had come out, if it was finished, the whole nine yards, only 18 months earlier, people were going out to the store and buying Barbara Ann and California Girls and Help Me
Yeah,
Rhonda. Great, happy, peppy little songs. Even Sloop John B is a happy, peppy song.
yeah.
How do you think the reaction would have been to kids, teenagers going out to buy a record with a song called Do You Like Worms on it? Like, do you think the critics would have loved it and the fans would have been like, I don't know, man. Like, how do you think it would have been taken back then?
I I don't necessarily even think the critics would have necessarily loved it. Looking at the way things were accepted at that time, it's really hard to know. I've also been, for a separate series that I've been doing, kind of looking at the Beach Boys UK releases for the Surf Wax series as such.
Yes.
And it's really interesting looking at how I basically been looking at their chart placings when they were actually released, and the chart placements, how long they charted for,
So cool.
and looking at how well Pet Sounds did, even compared to everything else they released.
Yeah.
It's in it could only have fared well in the UK if it released at the right time, because
Yeah.
the placement of everything at that stage in the charts over here was insane. And I think it very much would have been that it did well in the UK, maybe only in the short term, but it would have sold a lot regardless.
Yeah.
By the time SMiLE came out, and I realized SMiLE in itself is even less commercial than SMiLE would have been.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
and that didn't chart as well, but still sold far more than I would ever have expected it to.
It did well in
Um,
UK, not over here.
yeah, relatively, yeah. Um, but it's it's really interesting to think of it in that regard. Obviously, in the US, coming off the success or lack thereof, should I say, relative lack. I mean, top 10 for Pet Sounds isn't bad.
It's
Like,
amazing, but Capel
but
didn't see it that way.
yeah. And I think obviously if it ran off the wave of Good Vibrations, that would have sold a lot. But I think it all depends on where Heroes and Villains land, I think. And I think because I don't even say what you will about the single version, whether you love it or think that it's undercooked. I don't think that a full SMiLE rendition would have been received any differently, if
Right,
that makes sense.
right, right,
Maybe critically, but not necessarily commercially, I
right.
don't think. Um, and ultimately, I think it would have fared all right. It would have very much probably become the sort of thing where it fared pretty well at the time, but not amazingly, and then just kind of grown over the next sort of decade beyond that, as you kind of see Pet Sounds doing in the sort of word of mouth at that time, and
Yeah,
then just beyond that sort of thing. I mean, I still stand by that. What happened after it wouldn't have been any different if you swapped Smiley, Smile, and Smile. But I feel like probably going to get onto that in a bit. But
a lot of
um,
people have said the same
yeah,
thing. Like they feel like the line of records after SMiLE would have been almost the same. And I asked that because, obviously we know Brian was such a just amazing in the studio and always bettering himself than when he did the previous record before. If SMiLE had come out, do you think he would have done something better than SMiLE in the next record, or do you think Wild Honey would have happened because he wanted to take a break?
I think Wild Honey would have happened because it's clear that he just kind of burnt out on doing that. Not necessarily specifically, um, like with mentally and just with everything going on around, but just I think doing that music, as he said in an interview, I think it was the one where he talks about he's mainly talking about Samaya Smile, mentioned Stack of Tracks and whatnot.
Yeah,
I think it might have been that one, it might have been a different one. He saw Pet Sounds as like their peak of their orchestral period, and obviously Smile was kind of it's partially that, but also a lot of it is more stripped down than you kind of realize at first because the vocals are so layered, but also
yeah,
it's still got that studio sound to it because of where it was recorded
yep,
and the musicians involved. Whereas the Smile stuff isn't necessarily that much more stripped back in some aspects. Obviously, a lot of it is, but it's
yeah.
just because of the way it was recorded and who it was performed by that makes that difference, I suppose.
Now, I've brought this question up as well because, if you put the SMiLE album on, just the first 10 or 11, 12, 13 tracks, whatever it is, ending at Good Vibrations, obviously there's parts of that that still aren't finished. There's music without lyrics and vocals. There's just bits and pieces that kind of fall apart near the end. Do you think if they put the record out exactly as it was, unfinished, that the public would have even realized it was unfinished and be like, oh, good little instrumental song that leads up to Good Vibrations? Because I mean, by May of '67, Brian was basically done with it. But do you think just to turn it in, just to put the album out, just to get it out there after all that work was involved, do you think it could have come out and had success, or do you think people would have been like, "Hey, we're missing some bits here"? What do you think it would have been?
I think that's a really interesting question I hadn't actually thought of, weirdly.
Like, just put it out. It's there. It's
Yeah,
done.
I think partially, I think obviously there was the issue of actually physically putting the parts that existed together. But if they'd done so, obviously you've got to factor in that it wouldn't be exactly as it's presented on SMiLE sessions because that's more of the three-sided,
Sure,
three-suite thing.
sure.
But if I were to take, there's a few presentations of a like 1967 two-side SMiLE, which is how I tend to listen to the album if I do today.
Right.
And
Same.
um taking that into account, which obviously strips back even more of the unfinished nature because you can drop out tracks that have no vocals, such as
Exactly. Yeah.
look and things like that. Um, I it's an interesting one. I think because you kind of got a phase, and I guess you probably end up with them dropping in what would have been the single version of Heroes and Villains. Say he took it home, did that. That was the single they presented before they
Yeah.
then start work on the SMiLE stuff. And then that's what they slot in just to kind of add a round picture to it.
Yeah.
Um, Hmm. I think,
It's a hard call because like
yeah.
even if because they were basically done working on the music by I think March or early April.
Oh, I mean, there's so much that there's so many points where it could have just said this is done music wise, and there's just a lot of faffing around
That's
afterwards.
true. That's definitely
Yeah.
true. Because
So
like
yeah,
they knew Sergeant Pepper was going to come out in early June at some point, and there's no
yeah,
competing with that. That thing stayed on the charts in the top 10 for a long time. So I
yes.
mean, it's almost like they wouldn't have been better than the Beatles sales wise, even if they put it out before Sergeant Pepper came out. So it's almost like at least have a top 10 album. It would have been a top 10 album, I think.
I mean, it had good vibrations on it, and
Right.
in the US, that seems to be the way most albums would go. So it's got had a number one single by a very recognized group,
With a
still
cool
kind of
cover.
in that, yeah, still kind of in that period where things where they would have sold things on the name just about.
Absolutely.
Um, and
Absolutely.
it would have done relatively well, but I think there would have been an air around it of people going like, something like I feel like in the reviews it would have said maybe something about the production not feeling, I don't know. The reviews in 1967 are really weird to read. They're great to read,
I
but they're
know.
so they're
Music
so
critics were
dated
weird
and I
back then.
yeah. Um but I think it would have done relatively well. Maybe not quite as well as if it had been finished to Brian's original vision, but I don't
Yeah.
even know if he knew at the time what that was, let alone
I don't think he did either.
further down.
I think once Van Dyke Parks left, he lost his buddy. And he was just
Yeah.
kind of like lost for a little while after that. Like, what do I do? Um, what are some of your favorite moments on Smile? Because it's one of the most densely layered, rich recordings ever, and nothing sounds like it. Nothing ever will. So it's
No.
definitely one of those albums that sticks out. And what are some of your favorite songs? Or you mentioned "Child is the Father of the Man" before. Like, what else
Yeah,
is up
so
there?
I'm gonna jump straight in with that in a little bit more depth because I I think early on I was really fascinated by that chorus. No other example of it in the catalog because I realize it doesn't exactly crop up much, but the version that's at the end of Surfs Up
Mm,
doesn't draw me in the same way. To me, that's just like a cool ending to Surfs Up. It doesn't have that. The version on Smile has that real bite to it, especially
yeah,
Mike's first child, which is really sort of, especially on that second chorus with the extra parts,
yeah.
it's got to be like, child. It's like, sounds like a demon coming out the record. There's just so much going on in that, and I'd love to hear a stereo like mix of
The
the
break.
vocals for
Oh,
that.
be
Obviously,
great.
we know that doesn't exist. Sadly, I mean,
Yeah,
literally, it's a acetate that we have, thankfully, to at least hear what we have. But
make a
that is
duophonic mix.
fascinating. But beyond that, there's even just the verses in the bridge section are so musically, they just draw you in. And I've always thought that it felt semi-complete, but then when I hear the backing track that's on the 1968 Friends set, I have a version that I then plopped in basically the choruses. I made a finished version as such.
Cool.
And that's the version I just go to all the time, sort of thing.
Yeah,
And that mix specifically, so it's a vintage Brian mono mix. Obviously, that's what I go
I
to.
do.
And that where it's got the bridge part with the piano really echoed out in the distance, making it even more ominous than it already is in the
Oh,
version that's on the Smile Sessions box.
love that.
It added that final extra layer. I remember when that set came out and I heard that at the end, I was transported back to when I first heard the box, when I was first listening to those things, because
Yeah,
that was an extra little Smile treat that just was amazing. I'd love to hear everything in a vintage like Brian acetate mono mix where possible, and I that's a set I'd love to see. But
yeah.
anyway, um, outside of that track, let me have a think. So obviously, there's the songs that exist or were released as that. So something like Cabin Essence, obviously, an amazing track in how it like jumps around and all the everything that
Incredible.
makes it unique. That I'm sure other people you've had on have mentioned because it's one I see everyone mention all the time because
Yeah.
we have a complete
Amazing
60s
song.
version.
Yeah.
Obviously, lead vocals added on a couple of years later, but I don't think it would have been any different in 67 or 66, apart from obviously Carl just slightly changing the way he sings.
Right.
Um,
Right.
it's got that SMiLE, interesting use of vocals for the doing doing backing vocals.
Yeah.
But it's got that sort of, but I mean, that even goes into the chorus with the vocals sound like the train, but also the wind, and it's just insane. And that outro just sort of that disappears into the distance in this majestic and dark, but not too spooky way. It's something magical and ominous about it without
Yeah.
creeping you out like some of the Dennis material on 2020, for instance, like a fade on that, which sort of makes you go, ooh, as opposed to, yeah. And that, so for instance, on my version of SMiLE, Cavanescence closed out side one because it has to finish a side. It can't just finish in the middle of one. And for me, that's, I'd put that at the end of side one.
Good closer. Yeah.
Yeah. What else do we have? I mean, obviously, Surf's Up kind of goes without saying.
Yeah.
I don't really need to say any more on that. That I don't think I'd add anything to anything that anyone's ever said because it's just a fantastic track.
Incredible.
Yeah. I remember something else taking me back to 2011. My Only Sunshine with the Barnshine tag. That whole thing was fascinating. And knowing that is how it was intended to go, because leading up to that, I had no idea about that. And I think it was people weren't too sure. And then suddenly that happened. And that is the monomix that was prepared randomly in 1967 for Stacker Tracks, or during the Stacker Track sessions, they mixed that version, which is really weird.
I know that. That's cool. Wow.
Yeah.
Wonder why.
I learned. It's when they're just playing around with SMiLE stuff during that period, because it's as at the same time they mixed the backing track for the SMiLE version of Wonderful for Stacker Tracks.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So, which obviously didn't come out on that, but
imagine
same sort of things. But yeah, it's clear that was the intention, and I think a lot of my favorite parts of SMiLE are the bits that I have that magical attachment to from that period, rather than specifically ones that I enjoy the most as songs, because I think from that I enjoy them where they then eventually appear in the Beach Boys canon.
Cool. Yep.
Because that's kind of where I hear them the most.
Yeah.
There is something that just came to mind and went gone. I mean, of course, the workshop tag. I don't know. I was fascinated by that as well.
Yeah. It's just funky
because it's just this silly but fun little thing. Oh, and Holidays. Just love that as an instrumental. It's just so much fun.
And it works well as an instrumental. It works well on its own without the Brian Wilson presents SMiLE words. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It just makes me happy.
Yeah.
SMiLE has a very colorful sound. And I don't know if that's something that I'm getting from the cover, because often album covers distort the way I view albums. SMiLE is a very dark green album for me, and things like that.
Yeah, I understand completely what you're saying. Yeah.
And SMiLE has always sounded really colorful because it's got such a clean sound to it. Not clean as in sort of sterile, but like nothing sounds too dirty. And a lot of that's because we've got things in clean modern mixes rather than vintage mono mixes.
True.
And often at times it does get darker. So Charles Father Man obviously doesn't sound full of color to me, but yet it's kind of has that there. But something like Wind Chimes, Holidays, even Cavanescence, they're just, and Heroes and Villains definitely very colorful sounds. And I think that is something. There's a real as was kind of mentioned before. There's a real childlike flavor to the album, especially the stuff that was recorded at the beginning. So like Wind Chimes, Wonderful, sounds like it's childlike music without being music. It's almost designed to sound like it's being played by children despite not being.
Right.
And yeah.
So I like that point because leading into this question with how the guys would have done this live, because obviously over the next couple of years they would pick and choose some songs from the record to play live, eventually landing on Wonderful and Surf's Up pretty commonly in their early 70s set list.
Yeah.
What do you think the guys would have pulled off if SMiLE had come out? What songs they would have picked from the record to play in their live show in 67 and 68? Which songs do you think they would have done?
I mean, obviously, Heroes and Villains, like that's kind of obvious. It was a single. It
Yeah,
still was the single, and they
right,
did do that somewhat. Um, Outside that, though, I think Wonderful. Yeah, I know obviously they went into it in the 70s, but I think it could have been something they dropped in earlier on as like a sort of softer moment because they did do that in those sort of late 60s
right,
concerts
right.
with other material. And I think it would have worked quite well in there, obviously, with, I don't know, Bruce or Al, probably Al singing lead
Yeah,
because of just how they tended to approach Brian's leads at that time. Um, Outside that, though, I don't know if they would have picked up too much. I don't think they would have approached something like "Do you like worms?" or "Cabin Essence" because I just don't think it would have worked. And I don't think it's something that they would have thought the crowd would have got anything out of necessarily. I would love
right,
to hear it,
right.
but I don't think it's where they'd go for. Obviously, they pick some like there's some things I wouldn't have expected them to do from Wild Honey around that time, doing something like Country Air, which I absolutely love, and I'm glad they did, but
Yeah.
also seems a little bit left field sort of thing. So, um, yeah, it's the I mean, the live side of the group's one. I don't necessarily delve into as much, so it's hard to truly picture, but I don't think they would have picked up too much on the stuff outside of the singles. I guess Vegetables, if it was a single.
Which they did a couple years later. They would start playing that. So
This is
but
true. So
yeah,
who knows?
it's such a cool. The Beach Boys story is so full of what ifs and what could have beens, and which is fascinating and leads to endless discussions. Um, if you met someone who was getting into the Beach Boys and they loved the hits and they had Pet Sounds and maybe they had Sunflower, would you steer them into the direction of SMiLE pretty quickly into their Beach Boys fandom, or would you give them other albums first to sort of lead them into SMiLE?
An interesting question that I think I've kind of changed a little bit on over time because I see a lot of people now, I guess younger than I, sort of thing. Obviously younger than you, but I've realized I'm younger than you to begin with. So
You
um,
always will be.
this is true. Um, but I see a lot of them kind of talk about just Pet Sounds and SMiLE, and like they talk about them both like they're big finished released albums, and obviously Pet Sounds is,
Yeah,
but SMiLE always will be to me this big, as you say, what if, and it's a presentation of what could have been rather than just present as an album. And I think it almost bothers me a little bit that people see it as an actual album. I mean, enjoy it, like, but
are you on the compilation side, like some people call it?
I guess so. I don't.
Hot
I just
take.
see it as an archival release.
Right, right. It makes more sense. Yeah.
Um, it's almost just like this thing is a big box set of bonus tracks for Smiley Smile. Like I don't know, like um, which is a very I think about that sometimes. I was like, how would I organize this? But
Yeah.
it's I think I'd be wary of it to a degree. I think I'd want to give them context first because I think that I mean that was how I got into it to begin with. I remember listening to I know obviously it's not got all the Beach Boys vocals, which basically Brian Wilson presents SMiLE, obviously fantastic, but obviously
Amazing
you
album.
can't really compete with the original Beach Boys recording for obvious reasons.
Yeah,
But I'm so glad that it does exist.
absolutely. Yeah.
But I remember listening to that for the first time, and that was my first exposure to SMiLE, and I just didn't get it. And I don't know whether that was because of I wasn't enough in that phase, Beach Boys wise, that I kind of was I would fall into that.
Yeah.
Whether it was because it was Brian and his band, or whether I it just needs a bit more behind it to truly understand what's going on. I think I had slightly read, I knew it was this big album sort of thing. There was something behind it, but I didn't know any more than that. And I think given where it exists at this stage in present day, I think knowing that helps somewhat. It would certainly be interesting to hear it from someone that has no idea and see what they then think, because I see a lot of mixed opinions on that, as in like whether it feels unfinished or not. But just compared to my own journey, I think that's the way I'd kind of stick with it, and I'd kind of explore their discography a little more before diving into that. Yeah.
I agree. I'm on the same boat with that one. It's like I I don't think you'd appreciate it as much if you just jumped right into SMiLE. I think you need to have a little bit more context on their records.
Yeah.
Um, Frederick, man, this has been so much fun chatting about this record with you. Um, what sort of final words do you have to say about SMiLE, or what do you want people to take away from it when they play it?
For me, it's a case of looking at it as a really interesting creative explosion that just couldn't be contained and controlled, and just looking at just enjoying the mess that appears. And when it works, and sometimes it doesn't really come together. It's lots of great ideas that kind of just are great little pockets, and I think enjoying it for the ideas and when it what really works, just taking away from that, just what could have been, but also what does exist, and trying to just enjoy the material we have, because it's difficult to not think about beyond that. Just enjoy it as it exists, and just let the colors wash over you. just enjoy it for that.
Absolutely, man. Well, I really appreciate you talking about this record with me today, man. This has been so much fun. Everyone who's watching, the links to Frederick's stuff is below. His Instagram, his Spotify or Patreon. I put the Patreon link down there too for you. His
Thank
Back
you
to
very
Mono
much.
podcast, if you haven't checked it out, give it a listen. It's so much fun to put on and listen and just get involved with these records. But yeah, Frederick, man, thanks so much.
And thank you. It's been a pleasure. It's my first sort of real video based thing as well, so
Oh,
that's always a treat. So
there we go.
well, I mean, outside of my Instagram, so
Yeah.
enjoyed the mug.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for having me.